Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into, well, one of the really fundamental challenges of just being human, right? How do we cope when we're faced with painful realities that we just cannot change? Think about chronic illness or profound loss, or maybe some external situation that's completely outside our control. Our discussion today really hinges on which psychological strategy ought to take precedence here. Should the main goal be achieving full acceptance of that reality as painful, what's often called radical acceptance, or should we be focusing more on actively changing our interpretive mindset, our frame around that reality through cognitive reframing?
Hmm. And that tension, that really defines a lot of modern psychological approaches, doesn't it? Now, while acknowledging the immutable fact of pain is, well, obviously necessary, I'm going to be arguing today that cognitive reframing actually provides the more potent, the more active, and ultimately, I think, the more useful tool for deriving growth and meaning and real resilience from these unchangeable situations. It puts the focus squarely on the active construction of well-being.
And I'll be arguing that radical acceptance isn't just helpful, it's the absolutely necessary foundation. It's that crucial first step required to stop the internal struggle against what is, which is, the very definition of suffering. And it's only once that struggle has really stopped that any effective kind of mental restructuring or even just moving forward can actually begin. Okay, so my position, it's rooted pretty deeply in dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, where radical acceptance is frankly a cornerstone skill. It's about fully, completely accepting reality in situations that are just definitively beyond your control. And I mean accepting it in your mind, in your heart, and even, physically in your body. This is a really vital distinction from just passive resignation. We're not saying we like the situation or approve of it, and we're certainly not abandoning efforts for change where change is possible. We're simply letting go of that internal, almost desperate resistance to the reality of this moment. The mechanism of change is key here. We're addressing the difference between pain and suffering. Pain, that's the inevitable hurt of life, right? The loss, the sickness, the trauma. Suffering, though, that's that secondary layer, the resistance, the bitterness, the constant wishing things were different. That resistance, which DBT calls willfulness, it often generates these secondary emotional responses like self-pity or maybe extreme anger, which are really destructive. So radical acceptance works by reducing this suffering. It involves having us consciously, sometimes repeatedly, make the choice to accept the facts as they are. This allows us to shift our energy away from fighting reality towards simply observing the situation and gaining some clarity on what we can actually control next.
Right. And I'm approaching this more from the perspective of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, where cognitive reframing, which professionally is often termed cognitive restructuring, is really the core active strategy for improving mental well-being when you're facing these immutable facts. Now, reframing isn't just, looking on the bright side. It's quite a methodical process. It involves shifting your mindset, shifting the frame through which you view a situation, and by doing that, you alter its meaning, your subsequent thinking, and eventually your behavior. The power of this approach, I think, lies precisely in its structured ability to transform negative thoughts into, well, opportunities for change, really. It does this by actively identifying and then challenging cognitive distortions. Now, unlike radical acceptance, which seems to seek bypassing emotional judgment, reframing actually confronts those judgments head-on.
For instance, a therapist might guide a client who sees a chronic injury as, say, the end of my active life. That's a classic all or nothing distortion, to actively challenge that. Instead, reframing it as perhaps a necessary limitation that demands creativity in finding new forms of movement and sport. And look, this has demonstrable efficacy. Studies show it reduces symptoms of anxiety, depression, PTSD, because it directly attacks the root of those maladaptive thinking patterns. So I want to zoom in on the immediate utility of the intervention itself. This speaks directly to the need for action, I believe. Reframing is intensely proactive. It requires asking pointed, challenging, almost Socratic questions like, okay, what's the actual evidence for this catastrophic thought? Or could there be, say, 10 other possible interpretations, even neutral ones, for this event? It actively shifts the frame. Like like adjusting a camera lens, you know? It changes the entire mental landscape. Radical acceptance, on the other hand, often sounds quite passive in its instructions. It asks the individual to sit with the feelings, let go, simply accept. And I do worry that for someone who's experiencing really acute psychological distress, asking them merely to let go might feel, well, therapeutically insufficient. How does one actively choose acceptance when the brain feels like it's hardwired for threat response and this constant seeking of control? Isn't reframing the structured step-by-step mechanism that actually teaches the brain how to let go precisely by dismantling the destructive belief system first?
I see why you'd frame it that way, but let me offer a slightly different perspective here. Radical acceptance is not passive resignation. It is, in fact, an immensely active and frankly demanding choice to cease resistance. It's that conscious shift from what we call willfulness, that fighting against reality, to willingness in the present moment. And that's a state of mind that often requires constant conscious effort. It doesn't just happen. We actually find support for this kind of distinction way back in Stoicism. The Stoics viewed acceptance not as apathy, but as a kind of peaceful acknowledgement that frees the individual from trying to control the uncontrollable. And that, in turn, empowers them to decide how to bear the circumstance. Now, if you try to jump immediately to reframing, straight to finding the silver lining before that foundation of acceptance is really laid, well, you risk engaging in what some critics call toxic positivity, which is really just a sophisticated form of denial. You end up invalidating the genuine painful emotion, which paradoxically often just increases long-term psychological distress. True radical acceptance, I argue, must precede effective reframing. Otherwise, the new frame is built on a really shaky foundation of unresolved grief or anger. And this leads us directly into the question of sequencing, particularly for finding clarity and meaning. I maintain that acceptance is the absolutely necessary prerequisite for generating genuine meaning. If you look at psychological models of grief, they show acceptance not really as the end state of healing, but as that critical pivot point. Source material confirms that acceptance, when it's achieved, then allows the person to seek meaning, what some now call the sixth stage of grief. So by first radically accepting the reality, the painful, unchangeable truth, maybe the fact that a relationship is truly over or an illness is permanent one is essentially freed from the emotional servitude of fighting the past. This frees up the cognitive resources you need to creatively navigate what comes next, like establishing a new purpose or new priorities. Trying to bypass that initial resistance and denial, well, it only delays healing and prevents the eventual authentic opportunity to identify that new purpose.
That's a compelling point about sequencing, I'll grant you that, though I might frame it slightly differently. Cognitive reframing, I'd argue, is the very process of finding meaning. It does this by actively identifying how one can be, perhaps, improved by the reality, rather than just diminished by it. We don't necessarily have to wait for the acceptance stage to fully conclude before we begin that active restructuring. In fact, reframing is often the technique used to help clients overcome denial, which is, as you noted, a very common defense mechanism. The material notes that challenging negative beliefs is key. So if you merely accept the fact that you lost your job, let's say, but you fail to challenge the underlying catastrophic thought patterns like the all-or-nothing belief, I am worthless because I failed, then you risk remaining stuck in a fundamentally negative, self-debilitating framework, right? We use specific techniques like decatastrophizing to challenge these cognitive distortions almost immediately. For instance, the therapist might ask, okay, if the absolute worst possible outcome happens, say you have to move back home, what happens next? Could you survive that? By actively dismantling the projected catastrophe, the client finds meaning and potential growth in the challenged reality, which I'd argue simultaneously accelerates the acceptance process itself. Let's touch on a key area of psychological distress too, the intolerance of uncertainty. It's a major driver of generalized worry, as we know. Now, cognitive techniques specifically challenge this intolerance by dissecting the perceived need for certainty. We instruct clients to, test the evidence and probabilities. We ask things like, do you have a tendency to predict something bad just because you are uncertain? And could something good, or even just neutral, be just as likely to happen as something bad? This directly modifies the maladaptive cognitive belief that the future must be controlled to be safe. It's a deliberate, skill-based way to challenge the utility of worry itself.
See, I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning. Because I think radical acceptance inherently addresses the future-focused, analytical nature of worry in a far simpler, more direct way. While cognitive reframing requires, intellectual labor and analysis to dispute every single negative prediction, radical acceptance kind of bypasses that analytical trap entirely. Acceptance of uncertainty involves recognizing the feeling of needing certainty, acknowledging it, and then choosing not to engage with that mental command. Instead, you consciously shift your attention to being radically present-focused. We use techniques like observing and describing the feeling, identifying the physiological response to worry without judgment, and practicing willingness to stay right here in the present moment. This aligns much more with wisdom traditions that remind us that the search for 100% certainty is, well, ultimately futile. By simply letting go of the demand for control, we sever the connection between the need for certainty and the suffering that follows. To me, that feels like the most direct path to reducing the drive to worry. It stops the cycle before all that analysis even needs to begin.
Okay, but this brings us back to my primary concern about potential stagnation. While I respect the philosophical elegance, let's say, of letting go of the need for control, does radical acceptance provide the necessary mechanism for effort when that effort is actually crucial? What if a patient faces a situation that can be changed, say a bad habit or a genuinely toxic environment, but they're using the concept of radical acceptance to maybe rationalize stagnation? It is what it is. I accept this reality. Does the lack of structured challenge, the kind inherent in reframing, not become a potential failure point there? Don't we need that active challenge of the cognitive frame to maintain the motivation for necessary behavioral change?
That is a fair point about the potential for misuse, definitely. But that's precisely where the definition of unchangeable reality becomes so critical. If change is genuinely possible, then acceptance skills are not the only or perhaps even the primary tool you'd utilize in DBT. There are other skill modules for that. However, in the face of true, objective tragedy or unchangeable circumstances, reframing alone can sometimes feel a bit like gaslighting. Like a superficial attempt to paint a smile on what is undeniably suffering. Radical acceptance, in contrast, honors the pain fully. It provides the necessary emotional grounding so that when the individual is ready, they can then deploy those cognitive skills, like reframing, but from a place of emotional clarity, not denial. That initial grounding, I believe, is non-negotiable. So, summarizing my view, the evidence really points to the power of radical acceptance in providing that essential emotional grounding, largely by distinguishing pain from suffering. It is, I argue, the crucial first step, ceasing the often self-destructive struggle against what absolutely cannot be changed. And doing that frees up the mental and emotional energy needed to move towards what actually matters. This profound choice, this shift, transforms resistance into willingness, allowing for a necessary, peaceful acknowledgement of reality first.
And while I certainly acknowledge the profound necessity of accepting that initial pain, I maintain that cognitive reframing provides the active mental mechanism that's necessary to harness that accepted reality for genuine growth and resilience. It is the proven technique that actively shifts the meaning of the situation itself. This allows the individual to find purpose, to challenge those debilitating cognitive distortions we talked about, and ultimately, to improve overall mental well-being and long-term adaptation.
Ultimately, I suppose the debate really hinges on sequencing, doesn't it? Do we need acceptance as the absolute bedrock, the foundation, or is the active process of reinterpretation the foundation itself?
Indeed. And it serves as a good reminder that complexity, especially when we're dealing with the human mind's incredible capacity to both endure and to restructure itself, often requires multiple perspectives, multiple tools to fully appreciate the path toward healing and growth.